It was a night when the snow seemed endless, blanketing everything in sight. Sarah, a 32-year-old nurse finishing a late shift at the hospital, was driving home on a winding rural road. The storm was picking up, and the roads were slick, her headlights cutting through a thick, glowing haze of falling snow. Normally, Sarah enjoyed the solitude of the drive, the quiet time to unwind after a long, demanding day. But tonight felt different. The air carried an unnatural heaviness, and the stillness around her didn't bring peace, it felt oppressive. She brushed it off as exhaustion, her mind weary from hours on her feet. Yet, as she drove further, she couldn't help but notice how the snowbanks on either side of the road grew taller, hemming her in like walls. The trees stood eerily still, their dark silhouettes blending seamlessly into the pitch-black forest beyond. She hadn't seen another car in miles, a common occurrence in these isolated areas, but the emptiness left her feeling exposed. Vulnerable. Then she heard it. At first, Sarah thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, maybe the wind through the trees or the hum of her tires against the road. But no. The sound grew clearer, a baby crying. Her hand instinctively lowered the volume on the radio as she strained to listen. The cries came again, soft yet distinct, carried on the icy wind. She slowed the car, her heart pounding as she scanned the dark forest lining the road. The sound seemed to come from somewhere in the dense woods to her right. It didn't make sense. Why would a baby be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a snowstorm? She pulled her car to the shoulder, hesitating as the cries grew louder, more insistent. Her breath fogged up the windshield, and for a moment, she just sat there, torn between logic and instinct. Every fiber of her being screamed to stay in the car, to keep driving and leave the strange sound behind. But the compassionate side of her, the side that had led her into nursing, couldn't ignore it. If a baby was truly out there, lost in the freezing woods, every second counted. Grabbing her phone, she turned on the flashlight and stepped out into the bitter cold. The icy air hit her like a physical blow, seeping through her layers and chilling her to the bone. Each step crunched loudly in the fresh snow as she made her way toward the tree line, the weak beam of light cutting through the swirling snowfall. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" The crying continued, faint and distant, leading her deeper into the woods. Sarah paused, glancing back at her car, which already felt like a safe haven far out of reach. The warm interior, the locked doors, it was so tempting to turn back. But she couldn't abandon the cries. Bracing herself, she pushed forward into the dark forest, her flashlight beam shaking slightly as her nerves began to fray. The trees seemed to close in around her, the branches arching overhead like a sinister canopy. The cries grew louder, more urgent, as if they were guiding her somewhere. She stumbled upon a small patch of disturbed snow. At its center lay a damp, frayed baby blanket, partially buried under the fresh powder. Kneeling down, she picked it up, her hands trembling. The fabric was worn, the edges tattered, as though it had been well loved for years. A knot formed in her stomach. Where was the baby? As her mind raced for answers, she heard it, a sharp snap of a branch behind her. She whipped around, her flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating nothing but snow-covered trees. "Hello," she called again, louder this time. The crying had stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie, deafening silence in its wake. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees. Her chest tightened, and she instinctively gripped the blanket tighter, as though it could offer some kind of protection. Slowly backing away, she turned in what she hoped was the direction of her car, but the heavy snowfall had obscured her footprints. The woods were a labyrinth now, each path looking the same as the next. Her breath came in quick, visible puffs as she cursed under her breath, trying to stay calm. Another snap, a branch breaking, closer this time. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. Her flashlight swung wildly across the trees, but all she saw were shadows, the snow reflecting her light back at her. Then, piercing the silence, the crying started again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind her. She spun around, the flashlight shaking as she scanned the area. The cries stopped as suddenly as they had begun, replaced once again by an oppressive quiet. Then she saw them, footprints in the snow, leading away from where she stood. They weren't hers. She followed them with her flashlight, her stomach churning with unease. The tracks wove erratically through the trees, as if whoever, or whatever, made them was circling her. Enough, she muttered to herself, panic rising. This isn't normal. She turned and began retracing her steps, desperate to find her car. The wind seemed louder now, the crunch of her boots on the snow amplified as if mocking her frantic retreat. Every sound, the rustling branches, the whistle of the wind, felt like it was coming from all around her, closing in. Finally, through the thick curtain of falling snow, the faint outline of her car came into view. Relief flooded her for a brief moment, but it was short-lived. Just as she reached the edge of the road, a shadow moved across the headlights, fast and fleeting. It was so quick she almost convinced herself she imagined it, almost. She bolted for the car, clutching the blanket tightly as if it were her lifeline. Once inside, she locked the doors and fumbled with the ignition, her hands trembling so much it took her 2 tries to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the snowy road ahead, but her gaze kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the woods behind her. She didn't look back. The moment the car lurched forward, she sped down the road, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she reached the safety of her home, Sarah was shaking, the baby blanket tossed haphazardly onto the kitchen counter as she collapsed onto the couch. The events of the night replayed in her mind, each detail more chilling than the last. The next morning, unable to let it go, Sarah called the local sheriff's office. When she recounted her experience, the deputy on the line fell silent before asking her to come in. At the station, she was met with grim expressions as they listened to her story. When she mentioned the blanket, one of the deputies exchanged a knowing glance with another. That stretch of road has a reputation, he admitted reluctantly. Strange sounds, strange sightings, crying, laughter, even figures in the woods. We've looked into it, but nothing ever turns up. What about the blanket? Sarah pressed. Doesn't that prove someone was out there? The deputy sighed. We've found blankets before, he said quietly. But no babies. No one at all. It's like they just vanish. Those words stayed with her, a haunting reminder that the world was full of mysteries better left unexplored. Sarah never drove that road again. Even now, every time she hears the faint sound of a baby crying, a chill runs down her spine, as though the woods are still calling her back. It was one of those nights when winter seemed determined to swallow the world whole. The snowstorm had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing as it battered against my truck. The heater struggled to keep the cold at bay, and I clutched the lukewarm thermos of coffee as if it were my lifeline. My delivery route, a lonely stretch of remote roads in Alaska, had always been unforgiving, but I'd learned to embrace the isolation. It was part of the job, a small price to pay for the peace of driving under a blanket of stars, or, in this case, beneath the unrelenting snowfall. That night in 2018, however, would challenge everything I thought I could handle. I was about 20 miles from nowhere, the truck heavy with packages destined for addresses that were barely more than dots on a map. The storm had wiped out any trace of tire tracks, leaving the road a blank canvas of ice and snow. I'd driven this route countless times, but the absence of landmarks or clear markers made it feel like I was drifting through an endless void. Suddenly, the back tires hit an icy patch, and before I could react, the truck fishtailed violently. I managed to correct the steering, but not before the back wheels sank deep into the snowdrift that bordered the roadside. No amount of rocking the truck or muttered curses could free the vehicle. It was stuck, half buried in the growing drifts, and I was alone. Stepping out of the cab was a brutal reminder of just how unforgiving the cold could be. The wind cut through my layers like a blade, and the snow stung my face as I examined the situation. The tires were deeply embedded, the icy road offering no traction. Pulling out my phone, I checked for a signal, nothing. I was completely on my own, surrounded by an endless expanse of snowfields and dense, shadowy trees. That's when I saw it, headlights in the distance, their glow faint but unmistakable through the swirling snow. Relief flooded through me, and I waved my flashlight, signaling for help. The lights grew closer, cutting through the storm until the familiar silhouette of a snowplow came into view. The vehicle pulled to a stop just behind my truck, its amber hazard lights flashing in the storm's gloom. A man climbed out, bundled in heavy winter gear, his scarf and hat concealing most of his face. He waved as he trudged toward me, his boots crunching loudly against the snow. "Looks like you're stuck," he called, his voice muffled by the scarf. "Yeah," I replied, my words visible as puffs of vapor in the freezing air. "Can't get the tires to catch." He nodded, assessing the situation. "I can help dig you out," he offered, pulling his scarf down to reveal a weathered face. "But you're going to freeze out here. Why don't you wait in my cab while I work?" Something about his tone made me hesitate. It was too casual, too practiced, as if he'd said it 100 times before. His suggestion seemed logical enough. After all, the storm was merciless, but a knot of unease began forming in my stomach. "I'll be fine," I said, keeping my tone light. "Got a flashlight and plenty of layers." His eyes lingered on me for a moment, unreadable. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug before turning back to his plow. "Let me grab a shovel." He walked to the back of his vehicle and began rummaging through the equipment, but something about his movements unsettled me. They were deliberate, almost slow, as though he wasn't in any hurry to help. My instincts screamed at me to lock myself in my truck, but I stayed rooted in place, watching him carefully. He returned with a shovel and began digging around the tires, the beam of my flashlight illuminating his work. "You know," he said after a few minutes, his voice conversational, "this road doesn't see much traffic at night. You're lucky I came along." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Lucky." His pace slowed, his gloved hands gripping the shovel tightly. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Why don't you hop in my cab?" he said again, his tone shifting slightly. "It's warmer." The unease in my chest grew heavier. "I'm fine out here," I said firmly, taking a step back to create more distance between us. He straightened, leaning on the shovel as he steadied me. His friendly demeanor seemed to crack, revealing something colder beneath. "Suit yourself," he muttered, tossing the shovel aside. But instead of walking back to his plow, he took a step toward me. My pulse quickened. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. "You're being stubborn," he said, his tone now low and threatening. "Just let me help you." Before I could react, he lunged, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. Panic surged through me, and I twisted violently, breaking free with a burst of adrenaline. "Let me go!" I shouted, stumbling backward. My hand found the flashlight, and I swung it instinctively, the beam of light slicing through the darkness. He flinched, momentarily blinded, and I seized the opportunity to put distance between us. I bolted toward the woods, the snow making every step a struggle. The storm swallowed the sound of my frantic breaths as I pushed deeper into the trees, my flashlight shaking in my trembling hands. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, his voice muffled by the wind but laced with anger. "You can't run forever," he called, his words cutting through the night like shards of ice. I didn't look back. My only thought was to put as much distance between us as possible. The snow was deep, each step draining my energy, but I forced myself to keep moving. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered a cabin I'd delivered to on this route, a small, weathered structure tucked deep in the woods. It was my only hope. The faint outline of the cabin eventually came into view, its windows glowing weakly with the flicker of firelight. I stumbled to the door, pounding on it with what little strength I had left. "Help!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Please, someone's after me." The door creaked open, and an older man appeared, his face lined with concern. "Get inside," he said quickly, ushering me into the warmth. The cabin's interior was a stark contrast to the storm raging outside, the fire casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. I collapsed onto a chair, my body trembling as I recounted what had happened. The man wasted no time calling the police, his calm presence a lifeline in my frayed state. When the officers arrived, their flashing lights painted the snow in shades of red and blue. They searched the area, but the man was gone. All that remained was his plow, abandoned on the roadside like a ghost of his intentions. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that not every offer of help is given in good faith. Even now, every time I drive those desolate roads, I keep my flashlight, phone charger, and pepper spray within arm's reach, knowing that the wilderness isn't the only thing to fear in the snow. The man's offer to help felt wrong from the start, but I forced myself to stay calm. His gloved hands rested on his hips as he stood beside my truck, his tone too casual as he said, "Suit yourself, but it's a lot warmer in my cab." I kept my voice steady, masking the discomfort gnawing at me. "Thanks, but I'll manage out here," I replied firmly, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. He stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing his options, before finally nodding. "All right," he muttered. "Let me grab a shovel." He turned back to his plow, rummaging through the equipment in the bed. There was something off about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as though he wasn't in any hurry to help. My unease deepened, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I glanced at my truck. The thought of locking myself inside flickered through my mind, but before I could act, he returned, shovel in hand. "Let's see what we can do," he said, his tone carrying a forced cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. I kept the beam of my flashlight trained on the tires as he started digging, but his movements were mechanical, almost lazy, as if he had no real intention of freeing my truck. His eyes flicked toward me more often than they should have, his attention unsettlingly divided between the task at hand and my every move. "You know," he said, pausing to lean on the shovel, "this road doesn't see much traffic at night. You're lucky I came along." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a tight smile. "Lucky." The digging continued for another agonizing minute before he stopped abruptly, straightening up with an exaggerated sigh. "You're going to need more than a shovel to get out of this mess," he said, his voice adopting a tone of full concern. "Why don't you hop in my cab, and we'll call for a tow from town?" "I'd rather stay here," I said, my tone firm now, leaving no room for argument. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, his friendly facade cracked, revealing something colder underneath. He dropped the shovel to the ground with a thud. "Suit yourself," he muttered darkly. Turning back toward my truck, I felt a sudden, vice-like grip on my arm. My breath caught in my throat as he yanked me backward, his voice low and menacing. "You're being stubborn," he hissed. "Just let me help you." "No!" I shouted, twisting violently against his grasp. Fear surged through me, mingling with a burst of adrenaline as I planted my feet and wrenched my arm free. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Let me go." He lunged toward me again, but this time, my hand found the handle of the shovel he'd dropped. Without thinking, I swung it wildly, the metal slicing through the air. It didn't connect, but the sheer force of the motion made him recoil, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold fury. The mask of civility he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Good luck out here." He stomped back to his plow, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Relief flooded me as I watched him climb into the cab, the rumble of the engine drowning out the wind. But then he shifted the plow, maneuvering it so the massive blade blocked my truck. My stomach twisted in panic as I realized he wasn't just leaving, he was trapping me. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice high and frantic. He didn't answer, his actions deliberate as he backed up and inched the plow even closer, piling snow against the sides of my truck. The deafening roar of the engine, combined with the spinning amber lights, sent my heart into overdrive. I yanked the driver's door open, throwing myself inside and locking it behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. The plow's engine idled outside, the man stepping out once more. This time, he wasn't holding a shovel. He approached my truck with a calm that was almost more terrifying than his earlier aggression. His gloved hand tapped against the window, leaving streaks on the fogged glass. "Open up," he said, his voice muffled but commanding. "You're not going anywhere without my help." I didn't respond, clutching the phone like a talisman. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at him, willing him to go away. He knocked again, harder this time. "I'm trying to help you," he said, his tone sharp with frustration. Reaching for the flashlight on the passenger seat, I turned it on and aimed the beam directly at his face. He flinched, stumbling back a step and muttering something I couldn't hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat. For a moment, I thought he might give up, but then he returned to the plow, adjusting its position until the blade scraped menacingly against the snow in front of my truck. He wasn't just blocking me in, he was building a barricade, ensuring I couldn't escape. I knew I couldn't stay in the truck. The engine was still running, but if he decided to break a window or force the door, I'd be trapped. My mind raced as I grabbed the flashlight and a small multi-tool from the glove compartment. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I opened the passenger door as quietly as I could and slipped out, the freezing wind swallowing the sound of my movements. The moment my boots hit the snow, I bolted toward the woods. The deep drifts made every step a struggle, but I pushed forward, adrenaline propelling me through the darkness. I didn't dare look back, the sound of the plow's engine a constant reminder that I wasn't safe yet. My flashlight wavered in my trembling hands, the beam casting erratic shadows that made the forest seem alive. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. He was following me. Panic clawed at my chest as I killed the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My only hope was to lose him in the maze of trees, but the snow made it impossible to move silently. The footsteps closed in, and I pressed myself against the trunk of a towering pine, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "You can't hide forever," his voice taunted, carrying through the stillness. "You'll freeze before you get anywhere." I stayed frozen, my body trembling as I listened to the crunch of his boots on the snow. Minutes felt like hours as he circled the area, his heavy steps occasionally pausing as if he were trying to lure me out. Finally, the footsteps began to fade, and the faint rumble of the plow's engine returned. I waited, my muscles aching from the cold, until I was sure he was gone. When I finally emerged from the woods, the silence was deafening, the storm having swallowed all traces of his presence. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the faint outline of a cabin in the distance, its windows glowing with the promise of safety. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but the terror of that encounter would stay with me forever. Even now, the thought of those desolate roads makes my skin crawl, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look human. The faint beam of my flashlight jittered as I crouched low, every breath catching in my throat as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closing the distance between us. My heart pounded so violently it felt as though it might burst, every beat amplified in the oppressive silence of the forest. Pressing my body against the rough bark of a tree, I tried to steady my breathing, willing myself to disappear into the shadows. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and a voice pierced the stillness, low and taunting. "You can't hide forever," he called, his tone laced with menace. "You'll freeze out here before you get anywhere." A chill raced down my spine at the sound of his words, and I clenched the flashlight tighter, as though its feeble light could somehow protect me. I didn't dare move, my body frozen in place as I prayed he wouldn't find me. Every second dragged on like an eternity as I listened intently, my ears straining to catch even the faintest shift in the snow. Finally, after what felt like hours, his footsteps began to fade, retreating into the distance. Moments later, the low rumble of the plow's engine roared back to life, drowning out the wind. Relief mixed with dread. I knew he was gone, for now, but I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. Pulling myself together, I pushed forward, my boots crunching through the thick drifts of snow. The forest around me seemed to stretch endlessly, its eerie stillness punctuated only by the distant hum of the plow fading into the storm. The cold bit into my skin, each step a test of my resolve as my legs burned with the effort of trudging through the knee-deep snow. My breath formed trembling clouds in the freezing air, and my thoughts raced, teetering on the edge of panic. Then, a memory surfaced, a delivery I had made months ago to a remote cabin tucked deep in these woods. The place had been small and unassuming, its owner a quiet man in his 60s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. It wasn't close, but it was my only shot at finding safety. Clinging to that thought, I adjusted my course, setting my sights on the direction I thought the cabin might be. The dark forest loomed around me, each shadow an imagined threat, as I prayed silently that I could find the cabin before exhaustion overtook me. Time felt meaningless as I pressed on, the world reduced to the crunch of snow beneath my feet and the rhythmic thud of my heartbeat in my ears. The stillness of the winter woods was oppressive, the silence amplifying every creak of the trees and gust of wind. My mind played tricks on me, conjuring imagined shapes in the shadows, but I forced myself to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a faint flicker of light pierced through the darkness, a beacon of hope that spurred me forward despite the heaviness in my legs. The cabin came into view, its familiar outline bringing a surge of relief so strong that tears pricked my eyes. Stumbling toward it, I reached the wooden door and pounded on it with what little strength I had left. "Please," I called, my voice hoarse and trembling. "I need help." The door creaked open, revealing the man I remembered, his face etched with concern as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Good Lord," he said, stepping aside to usher me in. "Get inside before you freeze." The warmth of the cabin hit me like a wave, and I nearly collapsed onto the worn couch by the fire. My words spilled out in a frantic rush as I tried to explain what had happened, the plow driver, the chase, my desperate flight through the woods. The man listened quietly, his expression grim, before picking up the phone on the counter and dialing the police. His calm demeanor was a lifeline, grounding me in the midst of my spiraling thoughts. As we waited, he handed me a blanket and a steaming mug of tea. My hand shook so badly that some of it spilled onto the floor, but I didn't care. The warmth seeped into me, chasing away the worst of the cold as my breathing finally began to steady. Still, my mind raced with worry. What if the man from the plow followed me here? What if he was still out there, watching? An hour later, flashing blue and red lights cut through the darkness outside the cabin. I ran to the door as the officers stepped out, relief flooding through me at the sight of their uniforms. They listened carefully as I recounted everything, their faces growing more serious with each detail. One officer nodded grimly. "Let's get you back to your truck," he said. "We'll check it out and make sure you're safe to leave." The thought of returning to the scene made my stomach churn, but I knew I had no choice. Climbing into the back of the squad car, I braced myself for whatever we might find. When we arrived, my truck was exactly as I had left it, half buried in snow and still boxed in by the plow's barricade. The officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the area. "There's no sign of him," one officer said after several tense minutes. "But we'll keep an eye out." Another officer helped me free my truck, the engine groaning as it finally lurched forward, free from the snow's grip. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but I felt a flicker of hope as the officer gave me a reassuring thumbs up. "We'll follow you back to the main road," he said. "Just to make sure you're safe." That short drive felt like the longest of my life. The sight of the squad car's flashing lights in my rearview mirror was the only thing that kept me grounded, a reminder that I wasn't alone. When we finally reached the highway, the officer rolled down his window and offered me a small, reassuring smile. "You'll be okay now," he said. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call." My voice caught in my throat as I thanked them, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Even now, the memory of that night lingers, its shadows following me long after the storm passed. I don't know who that man was or what his true intentions were, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes when his mask of friendliness slipped away. These days, I don't take chances. My flashlight, phone charger, and pepper spray are always within reach whenever I venture onto those remote, snow-covered roads. I've learned the hard way that danger doesn't always wear a monstrous face. It often hides behind a smile, waiting for the moment when you're most vulnerable. Photography had been my passion since I received my first camera at the age of 12. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a way of life, a perfect blend of solitude and creativity. That's why, when I found a remote cabin near Bar Harbor, Maine, available for rent during a snowstorm, I didn't hesitate. The promise of capturing wildlife framed by pristine snow, untouched by modern distractions, was the sort of challenge I craved. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, and nestled deep in the woods. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. For me, it was perfect. When I arrived, the caretaker had left a neat stack of firewood by the front door and a handwritten note reminding me to keep the generator running as the storm intensified. The charm of the place was undeniable: creaky wooden floors, a cozy stone fireplace, and large windows that offered a sweeping view of snow-laden trees. I spent my first day exploring the area, scouting potential photo spots, and snapping a few test shots as the storm clouds gathered overhead. The air was crisp, the quiet of the woods profound, and the first flurries of snow gave everything a surreal, dreamlike quality. By nightfall, the storm had escalated. The wind roared through the trees, rattling the windows like a restless spirit. I settled in with a steaming cup of coffee, the fire casting warm flickers of light across the walls. For a moment, I felt utterly at peace, content in my little haven away from the world. But that tranquility was short-lived. A sound cut through the symphony of the storm, a distinct crunch of footsteps on snow, deliberate and too close to the cabin. I froze, straining to listen as the sound repeated. My first thought was that it might be a deer or perhaps a fox, but something about the rhythm of the steps was off. They were too heavy, too measured, too human. My pulse quickened as I reached for my flashlight, hesitating before moving toward the window. Pulling the curtain aside, I swept the beam across the snow-covered yard. The wind whipped flakes into a frenzy, obscuring my view, but there was nothing out of place. No footprints, no movement. Just the storm. Telling myself it was probably just an animal, or maybe even my imagination, I returned to my seat, though my nerves remained frayed. I tried to focus on editing the photos I'd taken earlier, but my attention kept drifting back to the windows, my ears straining for any unusual sound. An hour passed, then another, before the noise returned. This time, it was louder. The crunching steps circled the cabin, each one sending a chill racing down my spine. Grabbing my flashlight again, I moved cautiously to the door. My hand hovered over the latch as I debated whether to open it. Finally, summoning what courage I had, I unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp and unrelenting. "Hello?" I called into the night, my voice barely audible over the wind. The beam of my flashlight swept across the yard, revealing nothing but the pristine surface of the snow, untouched and glistening. No tracks. No movement. Just silence. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced, cycling through every rational explanation I could muster: an animal, a trick of the wind, maybe even a branch falling in the storm. But none of it felt right. Adding more wood to the fire, I tried to chase away the unease that was settling deep into my bones. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt magnified, feeding the growing sense of dread. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. A heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed through the cabin, coming from above. My heart pounded as I sat upright, clutching the blanket draped over me. The sound came again, deliberate and methodical, as though someone, or something, was walking across the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and a fire poker, the metal cool and reassuring in my trembling grip. Moving cautiously to the window, I peered outside. The storm had eased slightly, and moonlight filtered through the thinning clouds, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. But the roof was out of sight, and I couldn't see anything unusual. The thudding stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy, unsettling silence in its wake. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When it did, I stepped outside to investigate. The snow was deep, the storm having left everything blanketed in white. As I walked around the cabin, my stomach twisted at what I found. Footprints, unmistakably human, led from the tree line to the cabin. They circled the structure, stopping beneath each window, before disappearing back into the woods. They were barefoot. My chest tightened as I followed the trail, stopping abruptly when I noticed something else. Near the back of the cabin, etched into the snow with precision, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It was intricate, almost ritualistic, and it sent a wave of cold dread washing over me. Who had done this? And why? I spent the rest of the day inside, the curtains drawn and the doors securely locked. The feeling of being watched was oppressive. Each time I dared to peek outside, I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the tree line, but the woods remained still. By nightfall, the unease had grown unbearable. The footsteps returned that evening, heavier this time. Each step echoed like a hammer against my nerves, growing closer, circling the cabin again and again. I stayed frozen in place, barely daring to breathe as I listened. Then came the banging on the door. It was loud, forceful, and relentless. Gripping the fire poker tightly, I shouted, "Who's there?" But there was no response, just the wind and the sound of my racing heartbeat. When the noise finally stopped, I didn't dare move. Hours passed before I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, the fire having died out, leaving the cabin shrouded in darkness. The next morning, I ventured outside once more. The footprints were gone, erased by a fresh layer of snow, but the symbol had been redrawn. This time, it was larger, more detailed, and somehow more unsettling. I didn't wait to see if the intruder would return. Packing my belongings in record time, I left the cabin without looking back. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Who, or what, had been out there? And what did they want? Even now, as I sift through the photos I took during that trip, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Some places, I've come to realize, aren't meant to be explored. Some places have their own rules, their own inhabitants, and sometimes, those inhabitants don't want to be disturbed. The rhythmic crunch of boots on snow returned, each step deliberate and unsettling. They paused by the windows, as though whoever was outside was leaning close, trying to peer in. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, every muscle in my body tense with fear. My mind raced through the possibilities, an animal, maybe even a person, but the persistent movement and methodical pace made the fear all the more visceral. Suddenly, the footsteps ceased, replaced by the loud, jarring sound of a fist banging on the door. My heart jumped into my throat as I instinctively reached for the fire poker beside me, gripping its cold metal handle tightly. The banging resumed, this time more forceful, as though the unseen intruder wanted to ensure I knew they were there. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative, though my trembling voice betrayed my fear. Silence followed, broken only by the howl of the wind and the pounding of my own heartbeat. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in the cold air, listening for any response. Instead, what I heard next chilled me more than the winter storm, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, but deliberate enough to send a shiver down my spine. I didn't wait to decipher the words or understand the intentions. Moving quickly, I retreated to the bedroom, shoving a dresser against the door for extra security. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, the adrenaline surging through my veins making every second feel like an eternity. For hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening intently to the sounds outside. The wind rattled the windows, but beyond that, an eerie stillness had settled, amplifying every creak of the old cabin. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by half-formed dreams of shadows at the window and whispers in the dark. When morning finally arrived, I emerged cautiously from the bedroom, the sunlight streaming through the windows offering some small comfort. Outside, the storm had calmed, leaving the cabin surrounded by an untouched blanket of snow. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I circled the cabin, my stomach twisted at the sight of fresh footprints in the snow. They led from the tree line to the cabin, circling the perimeter and stopping just beneath each window. They were unmistakably human, yet oddly spaced, as if whoever had made them had taken slow, deliberate steps. Worse still, the prints were barefoot. A wave of unease washed over me as I followed the tracks to the back of the cabin. There, in the snow, I found something even more unsettling, a symbol, intricate and precise, carved into the ground. It was larger than the one I'd discovered the day before, with even more detail. The sight of it sent a fresh jolt of fear through me, the kind that lingers in your chest long after the initial shock has passed. I didn't understand its meaning, but I knew enough to recognize that it wasn't a random act. Someone had left it there for a reason. I didn't waste any time after that. Gathering my belongings with shaky hands, I packed everything into my car, my every movement hurried and frantic. The caretaker's reassurances from when I'd arrived, about how safe and peaceful the area was, now felt like cruel irony. As I locked the cabin door for the final time, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. The drive back to the city felt endless, my mind replaying every sound, every detail of the past few days in a relentless loop. Even now, weeks later, the experience refuses to let me go. I can still see the symbol in my mind, etched with unsettling clarity. I can still hear the faint whisper outside the door, an unnatural echo that lingers long after the sound itself has faded. Looking back, I realize I was naive to think solitude was all I'd find in that remote cabin. Some places, I've learned, don't belong to us. They have their own rules, their own secrets, and sometimes, those secrets aren't meant to be disturbed. That night, I locked the bedroom door again, driven by the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The wind howled outside, masking every small creak and groan of the cabin, but my nerves amplified each sound. The floorboards seemed to shift beneath the weight of the storm's pressure, the wind whistling through unseen cracks. Even the faint rustling of Travis moving around in the living room kept me on edge. At some point, I thought I heard him pacing, but I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was nothing more than the stress of isolation playing tricks on me. When morning came, the storm had softened, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow. I stepped cautiously into the kitchen, only to find Travis already there, sipping a steaming cup of coffee like he belonged. The ease with which he settled into the space only heightened my unease. He met my gaze briefly, his demeanor casual but his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "You said your car is just down the road," I prompted, trying to sound casual despite the tension tightening in my chest. He nodded, though his eyes flickered toward the window. "Yeah, but with all this snow, I'm not sure I'll be able to get it out today." Determined to test his story, I grabbed my coat and boots. "Let's go check it out," I said. His reaction was telling, his face paled slightly, and for a fleeting moment, it looked like he might argue. But then, forcing a smile, he nodded. "Sure. Thanks." We trudged through the fresh snow in silence, the cold biting at my exposed skin. I kept a safe distance behind him, my instincts urging me to stay alert. When we reached the road, my stomach churned at the sight before us, nothing but an unbroken expanse of snow stretching endlessly in both directions. No tire tracks. No sign of a car. Just undisturbed white, untouched by human activity. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Are you sure this is the spot?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Travis hesitated, his eyes darting along the road as though searching for a plausible excuse. "Maybe it's farther down," he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. That was all I needed to know. My heart raced as I turned back toward the cabin, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Who was this man? Why was he really here? By the time we got back, my unease had reached a fever pitch. I grabbed my phone, pretending to check for a signal. "I'll call for a tow truck," I said, watching his reaction carefully. His expression shifted immediately. The easy smile vanished, replaced by something harder, more guarded. "That's not necessary," he said quickly, his voice a little too firm. "I'll figure it out once the snow melts." That moment solidified my distrust. I spent the rest of the day keeping my distance, my nerves fraying with each passing hour. Travis alternated between trying to make small talk and staring out the window, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. I avoided engaging, retreating to the bedroom whenever I could. By nightfall, the tension in the air was suffocating. I locked the door behind me, shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. Sleep was out of the question. Around midnight, the creak of floorboards broke through the silence, followed by the soft click of a door opening. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen, every nerve on high alert. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving through the cabin, slow and deliberate. They stopped just outside the bedroom door, and for a moment, all I could hear was the wind howling outside and the faint crackling of the dying fire. "Travis?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The name felt foreign leaving my lips. No answer came, only silence, heavy and oppressive. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, every muscle in my body tensed. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, cutting through the stillness, came a low, guttural whisper. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was chilling, sending a wave of dread down my spine. I stumbled back, my legs trembling as I shouted, "Leave! I've called the cops, they're on their way." The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to assert control in a situation spiraling out of it. Minutes stretched into hours, and the sounds outside the door never returned. The fire died out, plunging the room into a cold, suffocating darkness. I stayed curled up on the bed, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally broke, I cautiously opened the door, my breath hitching as I stepped into the empty living room. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Travis was gone. The blanket he'd used was neatly folded on the couch, and the mug he'd held had been washed and placed back on the counter. It was as though he'd never been there at all. Steeling myself, I stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape pristine and untouched. But as I scanned the snow, my heart sank. There were no tire tracks leading away from the cabin, only a single set of footprints heading into the woods. The sight of them sent a fresh wave of unease coursing through me, their presence a stark reminder that Travis, or whoever he was, had been real. I went back inside and lit the fire again, but the warmth did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I spent the rest of the day sitting on the couch, staring into the flames, unable to focus on anything else. Even now, I don't know who Travis really was or what his intentions might have been. I don't even know if Travis was his real name. But one thing is certain, his presence left a mark I can't erase. Looking back, I tell myself I did the right thing by letting him in. Leaving someone to fend for themselves in a snowstorm would have been cruel. But that thought does little to ease the lingering fear. The memory of his quiet movements, his evasive answers, and that final whisper outside my door haunts me. These days, I keep my guard up, my flashlight, phone charger, and pepper spray always within reach. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the real danger doesn't come from the storm outside, it comes from the people you let inside.